Now, there are, of course, a lot of effects that one could talk about when dealing with suffering from prejudice or prejudicial attitudes or even behaviors. Here, we're going to specifically focus on two things, one related to the self-fulfilling prophecy and another called stereotype threat, which we'll both talk about. But so really what we're focusing here on is that one of the most common things that tends to happen from those who suffer from prejudice directed their way is a reduction in their self-esteem and an internalization of the negative attitudes that are held by the society around them. And this is just an unfortunate consequence of living in societies where certain norms exist and how human beings tend to learn about their environments. We talked previously about the IAT and how some people think that that indexes just cultural stereotypes as opposed to individual bias. And so that just shows that those things do tend to get encoded into our brains and minds. And so here we're going to talk a little bit more about the behavioral outcomes of internalizing those types of attitudes. Now, this can have a tremendous impact on the overall health, well-being, and opportunities available to those who suffer from this prejudice. So we have talked about before the self-fulfilling prophecy, but here it comes up again. And so just a reminder, this is an expectation of one's own or another person's behavior that comes true because of the tendency of the person holding it to act in a way that brings it about. So at a more societal level, just imagine that if there is some majority group that perceives the minority as lazy, if they maintain this perception, they're likely not to invest much in those communities because why would you waste your resources on someone you think lazy or is lazy, and so you would rather invest that in communities you didn't think were lazy. And this ultimately, that reduction in resources will reduce the opportunities available to those minority members. And if you reduce the availability of various resources and opportunities too much, there's not an opportunity to actually do work and contribute on that level, not because of any inherent laziness or dispositional qualities, but just because access is not available. And that then in turn reinforces the majority's view that the minority is lazy because they're like, look, it's great that we didn't give them those resources. And some people still hold this notion that with will and determination you can rise above. And sure, there are odd cases where that does tend to happen, but in a more, I think, effective way of thinking about how these things can dramatically impact society is that if you never have enough to eat during the day, you're constantly thinking about being hungry, not to mention the feelings associated with that hunger, and that will take away how much effort and energy you can put and devote into other things over the course of the day. And that will just reduce your overall efficiency and productivity. And it need not just be a lack of food, it could be lack of safety, it could be lack of schools, it could be lack of water, it could be all kinds of different things. And we oftentimes underestimate the impact of those social and situational factors and oftentimes get stuck thinking about the disposition of these human beings. But that dispositional attribution, in these cases specifically prejudicial attributions, can ultimately lead to this complex interaction of effects that creates the environment for those people not to be able to live up to their expectations and thus conform to the prejudicial attitudes. And once that circle closes, it just becomes a really bad and negative feedback loop that can get out of control quite quickly. We see this on individual levels too. If you treat a certain human being as, let's say, being bubbly and funny, and you just imagine them as being bubbly and funny, chances are you'll laugh much more at their jokes. You'll make them feel more comfortable. They will be more comfortable making jokes because they know that you're probably going to laugh, which is great for them too. It increases their self-esteem, and that loop will continue to go. And in exactly that same vein, if you have negative attitudes, it can bring about those behaviors as well. Like if you think about someone as being completely irrational or always angry or stupid or any of these types of things, what can happen is one can then start to treat these people in that manner, and that will bring about those behaviors in those individuals. So here's an experiment to just show how unbelievably dramatic these type of impacts can be. So here was an experiment conducted in 1974 by Word, Zana, and Cooper. And so there are two experiments here that ultimately just fit really closely together, and I'll talk about the results on the next slide. So In the first experiment, they had 14 subjects who came in. The subjects, they were brought in to take part in interviews. And so for experiment 1, the subjects were the interviewers, and they were going to now give these sort of mock interviews. The interviewees, the ones who were going to give the interviews, were a mixture of black and white individuals. And these individuals are accomplices of the study, meaning they were in on it. They didn't quite know what the hypotheses were, so kind of like how a double blind would be conducted in a medical study, but they were trained on what to say during the interview and how to give that interview. And during the training itself, a bunch of judges sat, watched, and worked with them so that even though their responses were not perfectly identical, because that would give it away, that they were judged to show equal sort of enthusiasm and competence and stuff like that, so that it would be very hard to actually choose between them on any sort of merit-based grounds. So the interviews went on, and then the things that they measured were how far the interviewers sat from the interviewees. So the interviewee was always there already, and the experimenters were like, oh, we forgot to put a chair for you. Could you just go grab a chair and then you can just sit down? And so they measured how far they sat down from the accomplices, who were, remember, either black or white. They also looked at the degree of eye contact that occurred, how much those people leaned forward, and how much they sort of swiveled their shoulders. Now, what they mean by swivel their shoulders is, were you looking at the person straight on, or were you kind of sitting at an angle? And so all 4 of these can be used as a metric for how engaged you were in that communication, right? So sitting closer together, having slight leaning forward, looking at someone straight on without tilted your shoulders, and a high degree of eye contact, all are indicative of paying attention and being focused. They also measured the interview length for each of those people and how many speech errors occurred by these interviewers. Okay, so just to recap, right? The subjects in this case were the interviewers. They interviewed some white and some black people, and then they measured these various metrics about that interview case, which was done mainly by judges who were watching either the thing happen in real time or according to or with video recordings. So in experiment 2, they flipped it around. This time what they did is the interviewers were accomplices of the study, and the interviewees were people who came in and took part. Now, the interviewees were all white people in this case, and now the interviewers had been trained by the experimenters to give off a certain set of nonverbal cues, and so they had one of 2 different types. They were either trained to copy the nonverbal cues that in experiment 1 that people had when dealing with black participants, and they were also trained to show the nonverbal behaviors when those interviewers were interviewing white participants or individuals, because they were accomplices, I guess. And so they switched it around and tried to make experiment 2 kind of copy the way the subjects acted in experiment 1. Now, there is no racial difference this time in experiment 2. So they were again trained. This was again done by judges. And so this time what they measured was how the interview performance was rated overall, how much the immediacy behaviors were reciprocated. Those immediacy behaviors were things like how far they sat forward, how much they had eye contact, things like that. And then they also asked all of the interviewees who came in, who were the subjects this time, about what their mood was after the interview and sort of what their attitudes were towards the interviewer. I'd highly recommend, if you need to take a moment to just kind of stop and revisit the 2 pieces and how they're going, definitely take advantage of that, because it will help understanding the results. Okay, so this is pretty unbelievable. So this table is for experiment 1, this table is for experiment 2. Here is total immediacy. This is an aggregation of these following 4 criteria of how far people sat, how much they leaned forward, how much eye contact they maintained, and how their shoulder orientation was, along with interview length and speech error rate. So here you can see that When interviews were taking place with black accomplices versus white accomplices, here's just t-test differences along with significance. You can see that the total immediacy rating is significantly different, where people were much more engaged with the white interviewees as opposed to the black interviewees. They also sat closer to the white individuals. There was, even though some slight differences, nothing significant in regard to how much they leaned forward, their eye contact, or their shoulder orientation. They were, however, significant differences in the interview length and the speech error rate, where interview lengths were much shorter for when black interviewees were there versus white interviewees, and the interviewers made more speech errors when talking to black interviewees than white interviewees. Okay, so remember in this case, all of this is talking about the interviewer, right? A whole bunch of white interviewers are interviewing a set of either white or black individuals, and this is the dynamics that took place for those interviewers. Now, in experiment 2, they trained the interviewers, who this time are in on the experiment, and all the interviewees are just a bunch of white people who don't know anything about the experiment, right? So no racial difference here. So here, the immediate group are the interviewers when they were trained to act like they had been when they were dealing with white accomplices, and the non-immediate is when they're giving off all of the nonverbal cues to act like when the participants here were interviewing the black accomplices. And so here you can see a dramatic change again, where when they were treating them like how it had been when white participants were present versus how the black ones were there, people's performance was rated higher, significantly so. Their rated demeanor was rated higher. People sat closer together. There were less speech errors. Mood was rated to be higher. Overall, the interviewer's friendliness was also rated higher, and the interviewer's adequacy was also rated to be higher. The only thing that is not significant is just that mood differences were not meaningful, but a lot of this could just be related to how few people were in this experiment. Okay, so this should be pretty wild, right? What happened is people came in and they treated white and black people differently. They looked at how they treated them differently. They trained them to act like that with just a group of white people, and they brought about in that group of white people the same ultimate performance behaviors as were originally shown in the white and black difference, showing that a lot of this difference had nothing at all to do with the race of those interviewees, but rather how the interviewers were treating them, and in doing so, they brought about those behaviors in the interviewees. So the reason I'm making such a big deal about this is because this is just to show you how, even if we're not consciously trying to internalize negative points of view about ourselves, we as human beings are constantly in our social settings acting, engaging based on those people around us. And this can dramatically shift our behaviors and actions. And over enough time, that can lead to dramatic shifts in the way that we perceive ourselves and our efficacy in the world. And it can have dramatic impacts on the course of our lives. All right, another big thing that comes up when we're dealing with people who are suffering from prejudice, and this is especially in academic settings, is something known as stereotype threat. Now, this is the apprehension experienced by members of a group that their behavior might confirm a cultural stereotype. And this apprehension can ultimately be distracting and anxiety provoking, and those two things can often lead to a degradation in performance, specifically in academic settings. So what we mean by this is, just imagine that you are a woman, for example. You've been told all of your life that you're not as good at math as men are, and then you're put into a classroom where there are a bunch of men and women, and you're told that you now have to take a really difficult math exam that is basically a sign of your intelligence and your ability. Now, while, let's say, if you have half and half men and women in this class, and they have actually roughly equal academic aptitude, what one will find is, especially if you remind them of their gender, women will tend to perform worse in those situations. And it's not because that their capacity or capabilities are any less, but rather just again think about
even at a simple level of being distracted. If you, for even a few of them, start thinking to yourself, shit, I can't let myself do badly on this because then I'll be confirming this idea that people have been telling me that I'm not good enough at math, and that's going to suck, and what am I going to do if I don't live up to those standards? And that pressure is really difficult to deal with. And a lot of times in complex exam situations, that pressure can work against us, right? Many of us are familiar with test taking anxiety. And this is much like that, except a whole nother layer of anxiety put on someone. And so you could see how that can degrade people's performance. Now, over the last 40 to 45 years since this theory was originally put forward, hundreds and hundreds of studies have been conducted to show that this effect is both reliable and happens consistently across a wide range of target groups. By that I mean just things like age being a difference, race being a difference, gender, socioeconomic status, all of these things you can find stereotype threat. And of course they can mix and match too, right? Like a female person of color coming from low socioeconomic background and being older when they come to college, they're going to get targeted from that in all four directions, which of course can be problematic. So how does one reduce it? Well, there have been several ways now that have been found to mitigate the effects of this. One of the first, and probably the most straightforward, is through the use of self-affirmations, because this can reduce the effects of it by counteracting the feelings of being incompetent or stigmatized. And thinking to yourself that, okay, just because I'm taking a math exam doesn't mean that I'm less of a person in any way. And even if I sort of mess up on this exam, that's not the end of the world. It's not the end of who I am. It's not a sign that all people are like this. It's, like, in that sense, one can reduce the effect that that has. In order for that to work, though, the affirmations have to be genuine and believable. If you just are lying to yourself and you know you're lying to yourself, it's not going to work. If anything, that's going to make it worse, because now not only are you dealing with the anxiety of taking a test, the anxiety of confirming other people's stereotypes about you, but now you're also suffering the anxiety of knowing that you lied to yourself, and why would you lie to yourself, and that just makes people feel even worse, right? So it could compound the issue if those self-affirmations are not genuine. Another way to deal with this is to encourage growth mindsets. So this is work by Carol Dweck originally, and so it's growth and fixed mindsets. A fixed mindset is where you think that you cannot change some trait. Like, a lot of people think intelligence is fixed, where they have a certain amount of scoops of intelligence and that's it till the end of their life. A growth mindset, on the other hand, is that a person can continually evolve and grow and develop their abilities. And in many ways, intelligence actually, if you're looking at it from a biological or cognitive standpoint, fits more with the growth style. Sure, there are some people who will just be uber smart or the opposite, but for the most part, people are average intelligence and they can learn additional things that will allow them to operate in more intelligent manners. So by having growth mindsets, one can get around this idea of these few things are all of what I am, and if it gets messed up once, I'm confirming it rather than saying, oh, I've just made a mistake, and this mistake is going to help me learn, and I'm going to be better the next time. And the next time then one does a little bit better, but still, of course, will always make mistakes, and then one just continues to use those mistakes to grow and develop one's capabilities. And when one thinks about the world like that, one is much less susceptible to stereotype threat. Finally, and I think actually great that it can be such a straightforward thing, is that simply learning about stereotype threat and being aware of the situations in which it can occur can actually help to reduce the effects, and in some cases from some of the previous literature, quite dramatically. So it is something to be aware of. It is something to be able to talk to others about if you think that that is something that is relevant. And then just to be aware that it's not always going to happen in the most obvious of situations, because there are a lot of weird strings and baggage attached to people's prejudicial attitudes, and they don't necessarily make sense, but they creep up all over the place. So just being aware, not hyper vigilant, because that adds a whole nother type of stress, but being aware.